Hi, welcome to Bernard's Book Club and this second of two films on Michael Sandel's The Tyranny of Merit. The first set out his ideas and this one will give a critique based on the arguments and the points that have been made during the discussion that we've now had on the book. And as usual, I'm going to set this out in two parts, each with 4 sections, and I've called these parts Welcome, Rebuke, and Looking in the Wrong Place. So, starting with section 1, Welcome, Rebuke, its 4 headings or 4 parts are timely re-evaluation of meritocracy, convincing context for meritocracy, persuasive thesis for the failure of meritocratic politics, and effective voice for the humiliated. So looking at the first of these, the timely re-evaluation of merit, well, really this is not a section at all. I suppose it's more simply a statement that although Sandel takes up an idea now 50 years old, and he lifts it pretty much intact from Michael Young, today's circumstances make its re-evaluation important, and it's a significant contribution to the understanding of what some of us believe to be a major problem, if not a crisis, in our social and political life. So it's valuable to present once again this challenging concept, all too familiar but rarely questioned. And in many ways, Sandel does this really well, not least in offering a convincing context for its newfound significance, which brings us to section 2. And here, although not without problems, his account of its long-term Puritan origins as a kind of psychologically driven, divinely ordained claim to superiority was for some a really intriguing theory and a really interesting episode in the history of ideas. Though for most of us, it was the short-term account that was most convincing and illuminating. That is to say, how contemporary conceptions of meritocracy are rooted in what the earlier film described as a political landscape transformed by multiple economic, geopolitical and technological paradigm shifts, ushered in by the end of the Cold War and technologically driven neoliberal globalization, all of which reminds us of something really important, that capitalism is not a single, fixed or predictable system. It can change, and it can change quickly and radically. And in this case, Sandel gives a really clear sense of how it has changed from a social democracy managed form of capitalism, where the working class had a place, a voice and a future, to a form where making money is more important than making things, and the traditional working class has very little place at all. And this points to another further strength of the book, bringing us to section 3, namely its thesis of the failed politics of the centre-left, where Sandel powerfully exposes a left liberal ideology trading on progressive sentiment, but whose real consequence was to legitimate exponential inequality, mask the rise of a new ruling elite, and preside over the move to an alienating technocratic form of politics. And here he does a really good job explaining the rise and ultimately the failure of the Blair, Clinton, Obama formulation of progressive politics. A politics that Sandel argues offers a false prospectus centred on the promise of education to solve all problems and become the engine of a universal rising, only instead to become a machine of privilege, hubris and humiliation. And it's perhaps in speaking for the humiliated, bringing us to section 4, where the book has its greatest strength, and in particular his account of what might be best termed neoliberal meritocracy became an instrument of political, economic, cultural and, most importantly, psychological harm for the working class, defeated and damaged by neoliberalism and demeaned and humiliated by the arguments of its meritocracy, proclaiming, of course, that in today's world we get what we deserve. And this, Sandel convincingly argues, is what really explains the current explosion of populist politics far more persuasively than an unreflexive and homogenised image of a closed and racist working class. And in setting this out, Sandel gives both a voice to this discounted working class, as well as offering a really powerful account, particularly of the psychological impact of inequality, all of which amounted, we felt, to a cogent and powerful rebuke to 30 years of self-satisfied liberal centre-left politics. So that's part one, setting out the things that we thought were good and strong in the book. Turning now to part two, which I've called Looking in the Wrong Places, we're going to look at some of the criticisms or the weaknesses we felt were there under the self-explanatory headings of parochial and limited in range, mislaid political economy, misdiagnosed problem, and misjudged solutions. So, starting with the first, parochial and limited in range. This can be said to be in both a large and in a smaller sense. So at the larger level, this is a very American book, shaped by American circumstances and offering an American and a Western conception of merit and meritocracy, which ignores many other conceptions of merit shaped by other cultures and circumstances whose meanings and consequences are far less destructive. So, for instance, the role of merit in Buddhism is much more positive and ultimately attached to the well-being of all beings. And it takes distinct and less destructive forms in the Hindu idea of karma and the ancient Chinese vision of an exam-based, Confucian-inspired, enlightened bureaucracy. And it's also parochial at the small level, in the assumptions that it has of its audience and its readers and their values, so that one of our group described the book as speaking to the faculty lounge of an assumed audience of progressive liberals, worried winners, concerned about angry losers. And the we to whom he speaks is the progressive elite he believes are still interested in the common good, telling them that deep and rancorous division means that we need to rethink our assumptions. But for many of us, the elites of global capitalism, which is to say those elites with real power, have little interest in the common good. And in these ways, it might be argued that Sandel's parochial focus, if not looking in the wrong place, is at least excluding a wider world and a wider audience, and therefore offering a much more narrow and limited account. And for those who are particularly critical of Sandel, more important than this, and what they believe to be the real problem of the book, is the selective way he uses and ultimately discards political economy. So his explanations seem to flip-flop between cultural explanations and economic ones. And when, on those occasions, he does ground his argument in political economy, as he does when he emphasises technologically driven neoliberal globalisation as central to the problem, the book is at its best. But when it abandons it, for those critical at least, his argument becomes less coherent and loses its explanatory power, bringing us to section 3. And that's because when he abandons political economy, he abandons capitalism as explanation, origin, and fundamental engine of outsourcing, financialization, marginalization, inequality, and all the ills that he describes, like Harry Potter's nemesis Voldemort. Capitalism seems to be the force that dare not be named, so that Sandel almost never uses the term, preferring less direct signifiers such as market-friendly globalization. And this seems deliberate, because to emphasize capitalism would be to detract from his central premise that it's meritocracy which is the origin and the foundational engine for all the ills that he describes. But to some of us, this is a misdiagnosis, putting the conceptual horse behind the explanatory cart and losing sight of the primacy of capitalism, emphasizing merit, which is in effect, in our view, a second-order problem. None of which is to say that his analysis of merit lacks, well, merit, or that the role of culture isn't important. Both the role of culture and his argument more generally are important, powerful, and well executed. But for us, merit and meritocracy remains a second-order symptom and legitimation of the real problem, capitalism, made all the more powerful by the consequences of its current pure neoliberal form. And in many ways, this misdiagnosis blunts both his critique as well as his radicalism. Thus, his claim that meritocracy amounts to the tyranny of the educated is one in a number of ways his argument seems off the mark, ignoring, for instance, how in Egypt in the run-up to the Arab Spring, graduates could be seen burning their degree certificates because they proved useless to find any meaningful work. While here in the UK, thousands of graduates are shackled with debt. Surely it's the financiers, bankers, tech giants, owners and inheritors of wealth, the beneficiaries and forces of capitalism, who are at the tyrannical centre of our inequality. Similarly, although Sandel communicates moments of real moral anger and often seems very radical in his tone, like his political economy, such moments seem fleeting, intermittent, and mostly expressed in the words of others. Thus, on page 88, he uses the words of Thomas Frank to tell us that the real problem, an interesting phrase that, is inadequate worker power, not inadequate worker smarts. While at the very end of the book, he once again belatedly picks up political economy with a convincing analysis of financialisation and some very radical proposals to abandon payroll tax for tax on wealth and hot money. But again, these points appear as unintegrated islands of political economy in a larger argument that seems somehow and sometimes less than the sum of its parts. And it's this reluctance to give full-throated expression to the radical logic of his argument, to appear objective and give a kind of classic, all-sided academic survey that makes Sandel seem to be speaking to the faculty lounge in all its reasonable liberalism. Indeed, the charge that he makes of Hayek and Rawls as critics of meritocracy who are at the same time somehow bound to it, who offer compelling arguments against it but share what he calls a meritocratic bent. This too might be applied to Sandel, who appears as a radical critic of liberal capitalism but somehow shares a liberal capitalist bent. Indeed, like liberalism, Sandel is prone to emphasise individuals over the system, looking more to Blair, Clinton and Obama, instead to the reigning form of political economy, that is to say, the reigning form of capitalism. And if such critics are right, that all this represents a misdiagnosis of the problem, then his solutions must necessarily be equally misjudged, bringing us to section 4. And here, for many of us, his proposals to alter the admissions process for universities, revive public space for public argument, place our role in production and the dignity of work at the centre of things, although all desirable, in the book they seem both abstract and anachronistic, somehow disconnected from the material and the arguments he's been addressing. So, for instance, his idea of the revival of public space looks back to the ancient world of Athens and Rome and the coffee houses of 17th century England. And of course, public space is indeed required. But surely this should be rooted in today's reality and our own working lives. And his looking back to golden moments of Republican politics seems somehow out of place, even romantically nostalgic. And equally, in facing the existential threat of climate change, surely Sandel needs to include us in our totality as both producers and hopefully conscious consumers. But the real objection, and one that casts the biggest shadow over the explanatory power of what is still a really good book, is that Sandel's proposals neither address the question of power or challenge the forces of capitalism, which, if this is understood to be the problem, would render his hopes futile. And so, to conclude, most of us felt that despite all I've just said, this is a good and important book, doing the kind of things we intended for our book club. That is to say, to open our minds and offer new perspectives about our natural, social, political and human world. And in this, Sandel succeeds with convincing clarity, altering the way that most of us now look at merit and meritocracy. Yes, it fails as a master concept to explain all the ills of our Western world, but judged against less demanding criteria, it was well worth the read.